Considerable time has elapsed since the gravitational anomaly near the hypergiant Carinae became a prison for the origins of the world. Each piece of wreckage found served as material for repairs, and now the barge resembled a grotesque monster, its body crisscrossed with convoluted stripes of scars. Adramalik remained the sole space marine on the vessel. Therefore he took an action for which his brothers from the Word-Bearers would have condemned him. He elevated several slaves and allowed them to carry their own names. One of them he made his personal assistant and entrusted with an important task. His name was Arvak, and with enviable purity he embarked towards the distant stars to gather a harvest of resources, technology, and slaves for his master. The other elevated ones served as weapon-bearers for Adramalik and accompanied him everywhere, even during the rituals. Another time, Arvak returned after a long flight and presented his report. Bowing deeply and without raising his eyes, the mortal reported on the meagre quantity of loot collected. There were only human resources in abundance, but this was better than nothing. It was always so. But this time he came with something interesting. "My lord!" Arvak reluctantly spoke after the word-bearer had ordered him to leave. "On one of the worlds I discovered a small folder with pictograms that might interest you. They depict giants that once appeared on my homeworld, and after them few remained alive." "Were they sent to scourge your world?" Adramalik asked reluctantly, standing with his back to the mortal and examining something on his own desk. "Not exactly, my lord. I was a junior officer of the Astra Militarum on the planet Saint-Denis," he said with a trembling voice. "I was among those who resisted the cult of excess and permissiveness that engulfed the population. Initially, monsters in thunderous armor arrived, bearing shades of blackness, the violet color of secret indulgence, and what disturbed most of all, a pale pink hue that simultaneously reminded one of the children of privileged classes and the exposed musculature of the mutilated. They called themselves the Flawless Host and demanded the surrender of Saint-Denis. "Children of the Emperor," said the sorcerer with a faint smile, and slowly turned around, listening to his subordinate's tale. "The Imperial commander, Lord Bellassoun, opened all gates to the monsters and plunged the world into the sovereignty of the Flawless Nightmare. But then came warriors in grey armor. They had pale faces, pointed teeth, and eyes gleamed with sheer blackness. They annihilated the Flawless Host and punished all who had capitulated before them. They were remembered as the ravenous judges, but their images were recognizable. The horrors of old legends passed from mouth to mouth. "Show me!" Adramalik extended his hand, and the mortal, still not raising his eyes, handed him the folder with pictograms. The word-bearer began to examine one snapshot after another. The armor of the Space Marines in grey was assembled from fragments of different models. The foundation was based on the Mark V model from the times of the Horus Heresy, but it was further augmented with shoulder guards, as well as incorporating helmets from both Marks III and VII. In their hands one could discern the shapes of the exceedingly ancient Phobos bolters, which were produced alongside the Mark II Crusade armor. Additionally, they wielded Umbra pattern bolters, Umbra Magnus bolt pistols, Proteus pattern handheld missile launchers, chain swords, and axes. "Well done, little Arvak," intoned the sorcerer, though this was more likely a taunt than a compliment. "This could indeed prove interesting. Go!" He left, and Adramalik continued to examine the photos. Some depicted both ancient and relatively new military hardware, designed and manufactured based on samples spanning the entirety of the Imperium's long history. The same applied to the Terminator armors. They were modified for the purpose of maintaining functionality over a prolonged period. Either they had long ago lost the capability to replenish their ammunition, or they lived by pillaging and cunningly adapting anything they could steal. The sorcerer began to muse aloud. However, he was unclear about who they were. One photo could have given him the answer, but it was blurry and yellowed with time. On it, one could make out the outlines of a white emblem shaped like a hook on the dark shoulder pad of a warrior. He headed to his cabin and began rummaging through the countless records that had been taken from the vaults and reliquaries. The words-bearer found several parchments with information about orders whose emblems remotely resembled the one observed, and he stopped at the image of a curved shark hook. "There it is," he finally declared. "Carcharodon Astra. How did I not recognize you at once?" Adramalik broke the seal on the scroll and began to study it. The Carcharodons, a mysterious chapter, enveloped in bloody legends in the minds of those who survived the Badab War. Emerging from the somber void beyond the far corners of the galaxy, they were strangers, both to friends and foes. Yet they stood in support of the Imperium. Determining their exact origin is exceedingly difficult, since there are no official records of the Carcharodons in the Imperial Chronicle. They do not appear in the archives of the Inquisition, nor is there information about registered combat awards. Often they are mistaken for other chapters, for instance, confused with the Reapers of the Void and the Blood Sharks. Whether the Carcharodons contribute to such confusion themselves, or whether it is a random coincidence, remains unknown. However, some light on the history of the chapter might be shed by the oldest of the military treatises of Terra, entitled Mythos Angelica, written at the end of the 35th millennium. This volume mentions a mysterious space marine chapter named Carcharodon Astra, who were dispatched into the outer darkness to punish the enemies of mankind, and relentlessly attack traitors, xenos, and apostates even there, where they might gain strength. These words are borrowed from an earlier source, which was lost somewhere between the 32nd and 33rd millennia. In other sources, the Space Sharks chapter has been mentioned, known for their heraldic similarities, as well as a characteristic, calculated brutality in battle reminiscent of the Carcharodons. It was precisely because of this trait that they were sent to wander among the distant stars. Beyond the Mythos Angelica, tantalizing hints can be garnered from the few Imperial subjects fortunate enough to have had the dubious honor of encountering the mysterious Carcharodons in the flesh. These could potentially include explorers of the galaxy and rogue traders. However, aside from such rare encounters, the only information obtained about them comes from tales of their bloody deeds, recounted orally. A bit more light on their origins could be shed by information retrieved by the Death Watch. This results from the extraction of gene seed from a fallen battle brother discovered at a massacre site. The body purportedly belonged to a Carcharodon. Just so. Adramalik rolled up the scroll, examined it, and then unrolled it again. Could the thief I hired have managed to infiltrate the rock fortress to glean this information? Perhaps I was too quick to dispose of him. He could have still been of service. The apothecary conducting the extraction noted that the gene seed seemed unblemished, although it had undergone prolonged degradation. What's more interesting, the seed bore several genetic markers characteristic of the Sons of Corax. These markers are rare, hence the connection to the Raven Guard explains their outward similarity: ashen, deathly pale skin and liquid black eyes devoid of an iris. However, there are no common phenotypes among them. Apparently, the chapter recruits from a variety of sources, and the mutation in skin and eye color is a result of alterations to their gene seed. Yet even if the chapter genuinely considers Corvus Corax their progenitor, many standard millennia of genetic divergence will likely introduce marked differences in both appearance and traditions. Twilight Walkers, the sorcerer muttered through clenched teeth. Apparently the rumors of their exile are correct. I recall that among the ranks of the Raven Guard was a certain Arcus Fall, originally from Terra, who commanded the Legion before their reunion with Corax, and they were cast into the outer darkness. Indeed, I cannot shake the feeling that I am not alone here. Those few who have survived an attack by the Carcharodons suggest that they are mindless berserkers who adhere to no tactics and do no planning. In reality, the chapter adheres to exceedingly simple principles. On the battlefield, the Astartes act exclusively as a rapid strike force, disdain any drawn-out engagement, and prefer to advance on their targets at maximum speed or stealthily to leverage the element of surprise. Tactical operations often commence with the battle company sending scouts to probe enemy outposts and identify vulnerabilities. If the targeted positions are well defended, the Carcharodons retreat. These retreats occur nearly as swiftly as their prior attack. They patiently assess the strength of the enemy's positions and then launch a lightning-fast attack at another point they consider to be weakly defended. Adramalik touched the bead of the Vox and summoned his aid. "Arvak, have your people installed shipboard scanners on all decks?" "Not entirely, my lord," the mortal replied. The equipment was insufficient for the lower decks, which had been connected last. "Initiate scanning and send 100 cultists into the dead zones. You will report all uninvited guests directly to me." "At your command, sir." Upon discovering a breach in the enemy's defences, all forces of the chapter are immediately directed to the indicated positions. They may use drop pods, thunderhawks, or mass teleportation. The attacking contingent often consists of a mix of tactical and assault Astartes, as well as veteran Terminators. Once the attack is successful and the defense is breached, they go all the way. They penetrate deep into the enemy's vital fortifications and try to inflict as much damage as possible. They attack at close range with direct fire or hand-to-hand combat. At this moment, the fury of the Carcharodons becomes all too evident, and few survive this stage of the assault. Moreover, their attacks always occur in complete silence. The commander's orders are transmitted over a closed and encrypted Vox network, and the Battle Brothers refrain from transmitting any words or sounds. To witness such a massacre unfold without a single scream is, to put it mildly, terrifying. During boarding operations in the Void, the Carcharodons use an ancient and crude weapon known as the Ursus Claws. Huge serrated spears the size of a small escort barge pierce the hull of the enemy ship to pull it closer. Once the doomed vessel is within reach, they teleport their warriors to begin a real slaughter. This technique was first used during the Great Crusade by the World Eaters Legion. Adramalik finished reading and put away the scroll. If any of them show up here, there will be an opportunity to interrogate one or again resort to homophagy, for avoiding a massacre is unlikely. With these thoughts, the sorcerer left for another corpus of the universe, where he recently discovered a rare artifact, a mirror with cracks arranged in a special way. When he first looked, the mirror responded with 4 distorted reflections of his face. Despite the stuffiness in the cabin, the glass emanated cold. He began to visit this place more often than the Temple of Knowledge and his own cabin, and even now he spent long enough here in reflection and dialogue with entities, one of which appeared with persistent clarity. "I am closer to my goal than ever. I feel it," he whispered in the darkness, which eagerly listened since he arrived. The sorcerer's gaze fell on the other. As hard as it was, he raised his head to meet the gaze of the second entity in the room. "So I must find the messenger?" he asked. The being opposite emerged from the boiling smoke, nodded its feather-covered heads. A ceaseless chatter emanated from its beaks. The word-bearer forced himself not to heed these words, for they were madness, and mad would become he who heard them. He bowed as the smoke dispersed, taking the demon with it. The immense pressure was gone, and Adramalik was finally able to straighten up. For the first time in a long while he exhaled, and the sensation as if a saw was operating in his chest left him. "Then it shall be done, Oracle," he said to the vanishing mist, and exited the quarters. The silence was broken by the voice of Arvak on the Vox. "What?" he snapped irritably. "One of the patrol squads vanished on the lower deck and has been out of contact for too long. Those sent after them disappeared as well. We may have guests. Head to the captain's bridge and watch the Void. I'll deal with the guests myself." He vanished into the darkness and materialized from the gloom in one of the unexplored sections of the ship. The corridors were splattered with blood, mutilated bodies of cultists lay everywhere, and the traces of the massacre led somewhere into the darkness. He walked along the twisted walls, doors torn from their hinges and sagging cable wraps, until he reached a hall where there was no light. Adramalik felt that the enemy was here, and drawing his ritual athame, prepared for battle. Out of the darkness stepped a space marine without a helmet. His black eyes and pale skin identified him as a Carcharodon. Spiral tattoos streamed down his shaven head, grey armour adorned with oath scrolls and abstract talismans. In places the armour bore crudely applied images of fanged maws, skulls and ocean predators. Presumably, with such primitivism, they express their devotion to the Emperor, for they remember him not as a god, but as a living, breathing titan. Their faith is ancient and based on personal memories, not the teachings of the ecclesiarchy. Terra undoubtedly is something more to them than a distant centre of universal bureaucracy. The Carcharodons refer to the master of humanity as the Void Father, and his vigilance has become for them an eternal beacon in the night, a curse for the invading shadows. Memories of him sustain their resolve throughout the long millennia of solitude here, in the outer darkness. They surely treat each other's talismans and those of senior officers with great respect. Perhaps they are even forbidden from touching the talismans of higher-ranking brothers. However, all this contrasts with the brutality that the Carcharodons exhibit in battle. Merciless is the best description of their actions, but even this word does not fully convey the depth of deeds to which they are prepared to stoop. In some sense, they see the universe only in black and white tones, and any enemy of the Imperium can expect from them brutal retribution. They fight with such self-sacrifice that they would make even the blood claws of Fenris Wolf halt. Someone from the chapter's librarians could pose a particular danger to Adramalik, for the Carcharodons trained them not as in other loyal chapters. Their librarians possessed a number of unique abilities. For example, they could cloud the mind of an enemy with a mysterious mental darkness, enhancing fear to the point of paralysis. The clouded mind would writhe with visions of watery depths, chilling cold, and the forms of twisting sea creatures. This rendered it vulnerable to attack. Furthermore, a librarian could conjure the image of a vast oceanic predator. The stones and earth beneath the enemy's feet would take on the form of jaws, devouring the foe, spraying blood. Yet the word bearer remained unfazed. After all, this was his ship and his darkness, full of power and sinister whispers. "Grimnir," addressed him Adramalik, "you have chosen an unsuitable place to die. The disposal of corpses is 2 decks up from here." Nonetheless, the Carcharodon simply cast his bolter and chainsword to the floor. "I will not fight you, sorcerer. I have come to request your assistance." "Assistance?" Adramalik was surprised. "My brothers will soon be here, and they will tear your barge apart. I, on the other hand, can help survive and leave this place, and then I will vanish myself." "And with what shall I assist you?" "Extract this from me." The sorcerer did not immediately understand what was meant, but then he looked at him with his inner eye, and realized that within the Carcharodon's body were locked 2 souls. "Ah, a messenger," he thought, "possessed." With a sneering smirk, the sorcerer said, "He can be exorcised only by killing you, so take up your weapon and fight. You have no choice." "No, listen, it's a waste." Adramalik interrupted him and at once released a stream of strange, negative electricity from his palm. The lightning confused the armor of his foe and knocked him to the ground. He was still conscious when the sorcerer stepped closer and delivered a strong blow that knocked the air from his lungs. Then he released a bundle of lightning again, and Carcharodon lost consciousness. While he was incapacitated, Adramalik reconditioned the uninvited guest's mind, embedding his own image with the semblance of a father into the void, and impressed upon Carcharodon the thought that he must protect the sorcerer from any danger. Also, Adramalik examined the essence that resided in the body of the Space Marine. It turned out to be a Tsainch demon, to which he assigned the name Myaton. The true name was so long, complex and dangerous that merely pronouncing it caused the eyes of neophytes to explode, and all slaves present on the deck went mad. After several hours, the prisoner regained consciousness in the torture room. The first question of the torturer was regarding the reason he had separated from his chapter. "Sometimes we do that," the prisoner began in a weary voice. "We ourselves are renowned for our reclusiveness and taciturnity. Some of us lose control over ourselves, and then our reclusiveness manifests as a genetic flaw." "Do you have a defect like the sons of Sanguinius?" Adramalik asked. "Slightly different. It manifests in 3 stages. At first, a warrior increasingly distances himself from his brothers in the void and hides behind a cold formalism. Meanwhile, he communicates with representatives of other chapters exclusively in High Gothic, although he can speak in Low Gothic as well. At the second stage, the brother in void shows extreme intolerance to all enemies of the Imperium, be it Xenos, heretic, or a misguided brother. The mere thought that someone could rise against the Imperium is a decisive factor in decision-making. The brother in void may execute anyone he suspects of treachery, even if the enemy has surrendered, possesses valuable information, or is not a soldier at all. The third stage I would call silent as the abyss, and it might characterize me. At this stage, the warrior almost completely refrains from contacts with the chapter, rarely leads the squad, and embarks on missions alone. "What does the term brother in void mean?" asked Adramalik. "This is how we are accustomed to call each other. The address is analogous to the phrase battle brother. We have special names for special units. The veteran Terminator squads are called the Red Brotherhood, and the assault squads are known as Devourers. Sergeants we call strike leaders, and captains are referred to as masters of the household. Moreover, each of them can bear an additional title, one of the two. The Reaper Prime is assigned to the one whose job involves securing new aspirants for the chapter. In other words, he oversees the conduct of the Red Tithe. According to an ancient pact, we have the right to descend upon any world and take its population. The overwhelming majority becomes ordinary slaves of our fleet and provides us with labor, which is so necessary during a long stay in the outer darkness. However, those who are suitable for ascension into the ranks of the Brothers in Void, we grant trials, and they become initiates of the 10th Company. The degree of their exhaustion during initiation reaches high marks compared to other chapters, but this is an inevitable legacy of our chapter's unique nature. The other title is called the Harvester Prime, an additional rank that is assigned to the Master of the chapter, whose duty is to seek for technology and lost technologies in the isolated worlds of the outer darkness. This is called the Grey Tithe. We take the technology of the world and further adapt it for our own needs or exchange with the Mechanicus for weapons. True, they agree only if we find some Archaeotech or STC, and if you find neither, then we resort to another ancient pact. They are called the Ashen Claws. Really? I thought they perished in that ancient war. Adramalik smirked. You know of them? Asked Carcharodon. I'm aware that they rose against both Horus and the Imperium, unleashing devastating fire on the Night Lords and their native Nostramo sector. After that they slipped away, vanishing both from Imperial space and from those records that survived the bloody massacre of the heresy. Are they here too? Yes, they favoured the planet at Argatis Prime. We have to act cautiously, as negotiations with them at best are difficult, and at worst can lead to bloodshed. Indeed, we only resort to approaching them under the most dire circumstances, especially when our numbers are too small to be swiftly replenished by means of the Red Tithe. The Ashen Claws do not regard us with the respect we deserve. Their Magister often attempts to provoke our senior officers, yet laughs and tries to turn them against one another. And how do you address your Magister? We call him the Lord of Shadows. I heard that our founder, Arcus Phile, bore the same title. Now, we call him the Forgotten, for his fate remains unknown. However, we continue to serve on the distant frontiers, as has been tasked to us. Do you want the truth, Corax Spawn? Adramalik sneered. You have no grand mission. Simply put, Corvus Corax did not immediately reunite with the 19th Legion, but when he did, he began its transformation. You see, at that time the Legion's culture was defined by the inhabitants of the tyrant's tribes, in whom he saw the mannerisms of prison keepers and slavers of the planet Lycaeus. Several high-ranking officers were displaced or reassigned, including your so-called Lord of Shadows, Arcus Phal, who had led the Legion for 3 solar decades before the arrival of the Master of Raven Guard. The displaced officers were quartered with free traders across the galaxy, and Arcus Phal effectively commanded one such merchant fleet. What became of him afterward is unknown to me. Adramalik walked from one end of the room to the other, paused, and then continued. You see, Spawn of Corax, during those years an event occurred that might drive the final nail into the coffin of your hopes. It is known as Istvan V. In that battle, Corvus Corax lost almost the entire Legion. He tried in every possible way to restore it, but made no efforts to recall you from your wanderings in the outer darkness. The only conclusion is evident. The sorcerer leaned closer and looked the prisoner in the eye, then enunciated each word with an intonation as if hammering one nail after another into the lid of a coffin. "You were simply disposed of. This explains much." Carcharodon exhaled surprisingly calmly and lowered his gaze. Adramalik exited the chamber and ordered the shackles to be removed from the prisoner. In reality, he had long since extracted this information from his mind, simply wanting to ensure that his spells were effective, that the possessed would speak only the truth and would follow all his orders. A few hours later, the word-bearer awaited him at the Temple of Knowledge. There he commanded Carcharodon to take up an ambush position and guard the entrance, but not to enter. Adramalik trusted neither the gods nor their messengers, and had preemptively set up wards to prevent the Space Marine from bringing any entity inside the circle until the ritual was complete. Moreover, he did not fully understand what role the so-called messenger was supposed to play. A warlock placed the tome upon the pedestal as the chanting of 8 acolyte priests reached its climax. He opened the journal to the required page, drew forth a quill, and began to meticulously make entries, careful not to touch the sacred pages with his palms. The first entry he decided to inscribe was about the battles of the enigmatic Carcharodons, a chapter that mocks what once was called the Imperial Truth. The first battle, recorded by Adramalik, was the uprising in the solar system occurring in the 32nd millennium. In the 32nd millennium, secret cults organized a series of uprisings under the leadership of renegades from the legions of Iron Warriors, Night Lords, and World Eaters. The governments of the planets were brought to their knees and entire sectors plunged into anarchy for one Terran year. When events took a dramatically dire turn, the combined forces of the Adeptus Astartes emerged from the dark depths beyond the spiral arm of the galaxy and unleashed a punishing fire upon the enemy commanders. The system was long tormented by minor local conflicts, which were suppressed by local armed forces. According to Inquisition data, the combined Space Marine forces were drawn from the chapters of the Carcharodons, Death Eagles, Angels of Redemption, and Minotaurs. Information about the next event was so scant that Adramalik felt his disappointment resonating in waves across the Imperium. An acolyte approached him and unfolded scrolls. After comparing the written word with that extracted from the mind of a Carcharodon, he made an entry. During a dark and bloody episode of Imperial history, known as the War of the False Primarch in the year 860 of the 33rd millennium, the High Lords of Terror convened the so-called Pentarchy of Blood to make a decision and end the disturbances in the Segmentum Pacificus. The Pentarchy included the Carcharodons, Death Eagles, Red Talons, Mortifactors, and Flesh Tearers. They were assigned to sequentially annihilate 11 Space Marine chapters recognized as renegades. Their homeworlds were laid waste. In the year 811 of the 37th millennium, Abaddon the Despoiler led a band of Khorne berserkers against the positions of the Blood Angels on the world of Median during the 7th Black Crusade. The defense of the Loyalists weakened by the second, and even the Blood Angels' assault squads could not dislodge the mad Chaosites and reclaim the bodies of their fallen comrades. In the mind of a possessed captive, the images of this event were carefully blurred. But Adramalik remembered a vague reference from the semi-mythical folio called The Hymn of Cassandra and the Lion, where it spoke of a silver-armoured chapter of the Adeptus Astartes that came from the outer darkness to aid the Imperium, whose toothy maw devoured stars, and whose black gaze reflected the void of oblivion. The hymn declared that the ships of this chapter crashed from the darkness upon the servants of the Skull-Takers with great fury, invisible like a beast lurking in the depth of black waters. Death for death, blood for blood. Thus the sons of Sanguinius received a respite and turned upon their pursuers, and so the cursed traitors of false gods suffered defeat. The depiction of these events can be seen on the walls of the tomb world Giphysitis in the form of repeating frescoes and reliefs, but the faces of the Space Marines who came to the rescue are obscured by discs of black obsidian. The 8-pointed star beneath the book blazed white, the book trembled, and a page turned on its own as if seeking more information. The sorcerer felt sweat bead on his forehead. The 8 priests sang louder, welcoming the 4. Adramalik dipped his pen back into the ink and continued. During the war in the Calixis sector known as the Angevin Crusade, the rogue trader Basil Harotis led his private fleet against the Drukhari pirates on the planet Loth. But his forces rapidly diminished in the midst of battle on the world of eternal night. Under the cover of perpetually swirling clouds, the rogue trader's soldiers suffered from the brutal raids of the Xenos. When Harotis devised a plan of retreat, the Dark Eldar suddenly struck at his ship, beating the starship from low orbit. The crashed barge became both a refuge and a prison for the trader and his people. The Xenos delivered swift strikes, capturing slaves. Harotis had no choice but to send a distress signal and pray to the Emperor to be heard. In the midst of the ferocious battle, a flash of light illuminated one of the ship's compartments. After it faded, 2 space marines in Terminator armor appeared amidst the enemy crowd. Moments later, the decks were soaked with enemy blood, and the panicked Dark Eldar tried to flee the ship. But on the shadow-enshrouded plains appeared Thunderhawk gunships, from the belly of which disembarked 30 Astartes in grey armor. They fired not a single shot nor spoke a word, even as the Xenos charged at them. When the enemy was within 100 meters, the surface of Loth saw light for the first time. The beams of an orbital strike cut through the ground, turning the enemy into ash. Only then did the strangers move to hunt the survivors. Later, under interrogation by the Inquisition, Harotis reported that these space marines had deathly pale skin, empty black eyes and pointed teeth. They spoke in ancient High Gothic and demanded as their fee for salvation 1/10 of the military supplies from the ship's stores. The following record is based on a report from the exploratory fleet Hydrax Lambda 15. During a major expedition in the vicinity of the Magnus Storm anomaly, the exploratory fleet Hydrax Lambda 15 encountered a large, fearsome orc ship adrift. It bore numerous signs of a heavy battle which had taken place no later than a few Terran years ago. The corridors and compartments of the ship were carpeted with a layer of orc remains, from the looks of which one could surmise that the Xenos had perished as a result of injuries inflicted by bladed and chain weapons, as well as intense bolter fire. In one of the central compartments of the ship's gun deck, where apparently the main battle took place, the orc remains and debris had been deliberately piled into a mound several meters high, atop which stood a standard adorned with an aquila. Dangling from the standard were amulets in the shape of predatory animal fangs and oath scrolls. The standard itself proudly bore the inscription Carcharodon Astra, as the Emperor willed. No remains of the attackers were found, nor was it possible to determine the exact origin or course of the orc ship, which soon burned in the nearest sun. In the year 875 of the 41st millennium, the colony world of Zartak was subjected to an attack by the Night Lords, who captured the ship Imperial Truth, lured the Arbite's forces into a trap and destroyed them. Later, they landed on the planet and initiated a bloody reign of terror. The objective of the sorcerer Shadrach was a boy named Mika Doran Skell, a psyker of immense potential and a convicted criminal. By a twist of fate, the Carcharodons turned their gaze upon the planet and decided to collect its red tithe. In the dark corridors of the underground prison, fierce battles erupted, testing the skills of both sides. The tunnels and mine shafts were stained with post-human blood as the Night Lords were cornered. The final battle took place in the main geothermal shaft, where the leader of the Night Lords was killed along with his bodyguards, and a demonic ritual was halted by the Carcharodon's chief librarian, Te Kahurangi. After the end of the hostilities, the Carcharodons collected the red tithe, leaving only a wounded and blood-soaked arbiter surrounded by countless dead bodies as the sole living soul. Out of nearly 80 Carcharodons, only 37 warriors survived, and Mika Doran Skell underwent gene seed transplant operations and became a pupil of Te Kahurangi. The surviving prisoners replenished the Carcharodon fleet's crew. From the beginning of the 800th year, the Carcharodons found themselves embroiled in a war of attrition, as Tyranids, attracted by the light of the Astronomicon, increasingly breached the Imperium's borders. Until a certain point, they managed to destroy the splinter fleets as they approached the edge of the galaxy. But soon even Tiberius himself realized that the chapter's actions were only a temporary measure against the advancing Hive Fleet Leviathan. Later, in the 41st millennium, it was discovered that the cult of the Starry Saints was thoroughly infected by Djinn-stealers, with members of their cult infiltrating all levels of the society of the sanctuary world of Piety 5. The psychic signal of the cult was so powerful that it could lure the Hive fleet from under the galactic plane. Their numbers were so vast that Tiberius feared the complete annihilation of the chapter. Invoking ancient pacts, the Carcharodons attempted to persuade the Ashen Claws to assist them. Meanwhile, the Third Company, under the command of Captain Baal Shah, set off for Purity 5 to suppress the infestation. Tiberius hoped that ceasing the psychic signal of the Genestealer Patriarch would be enough to reverse the tide. Provoking the cult into a general uprising, the Carcharodons broke through thousands of cultists until they were overwhelmed by numbers and forced into defense. However, everything was proceeding according to plan, as Baal Shah had released not only his Terminator squads, but also an ancient Contemptor dreadnought named Ithaca, who burst through countless screaming mutants. Adramalik exerted considerable effort to concentrate on the event while filling the diary's pages and find its imprint in the harp. He wished to see it. No one knew exactly how the wandering ancestor Ithaca first fell. The chaplains of Carcharodon Astra, keepers of the chapter's ancient and semi-mechanical past, told varying tales according to the situation. Some said he was the first Reaper, who for 2 days and 1 night alone defended a breach in the fortress against a horde of insect-like Crulides, filling the breach with twitching corpses until they were overwhelmed by their toxin. Others claimed that he was the champion of the Third Company during one of the first Black Crusades, having fought a Lord of Chaos. The traitor's last mighty strike brought him down, but before darkness claimed Ithaca, he decapitated the warrior, turning his cadre into a rout. Most likely, the truth is destined to remain unknown. However, whatever battle led to his entombment in an armoured sarcophagus, the great Contemptor dreadnought has since eclipsed it with a dozen grand feats. Clad in grey-black armour, the war machine, in a blood frenzy, destroyed armies and dealt with its overlords from the outer darkness to the lower sectors. Shah had seen it in action once, a decade ago. None of the ancients of the Third Company had been awakened from their deep, cold slumber for many years since they last faced such a dire threat that Nekora and Utulu dared to bring one of the resurrected heroes back to full consciousness. And so he screamed. It was a ghastly, semi-human and semi-mechanical sound with a wheeze and a grind, emanating from the grill on the war machine's chest. To the brothers in the void. Inside the cathedral it seemed out of place, a violation of tradition and a reminder that whoever the current inhabitant of the Contemptor's armoured shell was, he was far from the warrior he once was. Such was the price for awakening one of the wandering ancestors. When they were given freedom, little could be predicted beyond the devastation they would wreak. Ithaca took 2 steps, leaving the frame of the drop pod. Its huge metallic supports chimed against the plasteel. On the move, he slightly twisted his torso, as if surveying the slaughter his descent onto the lectern had unleashed. The onslaught of the Xenos momentarily halted. The mere arrival of the dreadnought sufficed to break the spirit of the attackers. Even the Patriarch and his pure-blooded followers withdrew from combat, starting to stealthily circle around the altar platform, sharply turning their heads and redirecting the gaze of the Carcharodons to the clanking monster, suddenly among them. Ithaca screamed again, partly out of fury, partly out of pain. This time, following the terrifying noise, was the roaring buzz of igniting air. The dreadnought's twin heavy flamers, embedded in its torso, spewed a stream of flaming promethium onto the recuperating occultists. The lectern was plunged back into chaos. The Carcharodons opened fire. Occultists surged forward, with even greater retreat than before. Ithaca met them, flamers lowered, though from the blackened barrels still spurted small clumps, and into action went the colossal fists of the Contemptor. A massive siege claw on one of them snapped shut around the first hybrid to rush at the dreadnought, slicing the creature into 4 parts with one compression of its huge blades. At the same time, with a roar, The weapon on the left hand, a tri-headed siege drill, sprang into action. 3 rotating adamantium heads bore into another hybrid, turning it into a red mist in a single heartbeat. The grey frontal armour of the walking giant was spattered with arterial blood and gore. As if tired from the administered beating, the huge contemptor turned while on the move, crushing another clawed hybrid from the later generations beneath its bulk. It sensed the Patriarch and his bodyguards, who also moved to meet it, leaving the weaker hybrid species and their Ginstealer masters to cover the Carcharodons' lines of fire and take the bolter shots that could otherwise kill them. Such bloodshed ultimately forced the Patriarch into the open, where the vile creature was destroyed by the librarian of the Third Company. The death of their leader threw the remaining non-human filth into disarray, and they were shattered against the anvil of grey ceramite armour. The hammer strike followed with the sudden arrival of reinforcements, the Ashen Claws, and within several solar hours, the cult of the Starry Saints was routed. The sudden cessation of the psychic beacon caused the nearby Hive fleet to slow its advance and retreat back into the void beneath the galactic plane. This saved the Carcharodons from extinction. Several solar weeks later, Imperial forces arrived at Purity 5 and commenced the extermination of the few surviving Ginstealers. The Imperium never fully learned of the sacrifice of the Carcharodons and the ineffable horror they helped to halt. The priests did not note this, but in the eyes of Adramalik the diary gradually changed, teeth growing at the edges of its pages, the pages themselves shimmering with unnatural colours. The pen began to twist in the hand as if it were a muscular serpent. The word-bearer cried out in the ancient dialect of Colchis and felt the currents of the warp condense under the onslaught of his lethal words. The entities longed for continuation, for the following record spoke of the most blood-stained exploits of the Carcharodons, the Badab War. Arriving unannounced in the Maelstrom Zone, the Carcharodons proved to be an utter surprise for both the Loyalists and the Renegades. Their sudden appearance at the edge of the Golgotha Wastes initially caused alarm in both camps. Their forces were equivalent to 6 companies of the Adeptus Astartes, led by the ominous first captain Tiberos, also known as the Red Wake. Their fleet was composed mainly of small to medium ships and auxiliary vessels, under the command of a single battle barge of an unconventional model. It was unclear whether this force represented the entire strength of the Carcharodons. Tiberos offered an unexpected collaboration to Inquisitor Legate Freyne and Lord Commander Kuln, providing them with a writ of recognition that granted them their rights and titles, conferred by several now-deceased High Lords and Inquisitors. Tiberos even agreed to a gene seed verification by Freyne's subordinates, but the openness of his chapter lasted only until a certain point, and some answers were given solely to Freyne. Despite remaining concerns, by this time the Badab War was approaching its final stage, and both Lord Commander Cullen and Legate Freyne knew that fresh forces would be indispensable for continuing the offence and quickly ending the conflict. Lord Commander Cullen incorporated the Carcharodons into his battle plans, though he still worried about their loyalty and was deeply concerned about how far they had strayed from the Codex during their long wanderings in the dark. Lord Commander Cullen chose the Indomitus Cluster as the first deployment site for the Carcharodons. The cluster was home to the severely weakened separatist forces of the Mantis Warriors. At that time they were being attacked by the Firehawks, who had suffered heavy losses in the capture of Sagan. The surviving Mantis Warriors, divided into small groups, were still conducting a highly effective guerrilla war in the cluster, supported by the local populace. The response of the Carcharodons was straightforward: systematic extermination. One by one they attacked the worlds harbouring Mantis Warriors and applied a scorched earth tactic against them, destroying the infrastructure and inflicting significant casualties. In many cases, they deliberately left many survivors to suffer, as a punishment to the local inhabitants for their disobedience and forcing the noble Mantis Warriors to come to their aid. After a year, the stubborn resistance of the Indomitus Cluster was crushed, and the Mantis Warriors were completely depleted. Recognizing the effectiveness of the Carcharodons, Lord Commander Cullen designated a central role for such an aggressive chapter in the final strike on Badab Primaris, and tasked them with attacking the planetary network of hive infrastructure, while the Star Phantoms were to conduct a meticulously planned siege of the palace of Lufkut-Huron. Descending like a ravenous predator upon the hives of Badab, the Carcharodons orchestrated a massacre, systematically damaging the cores of the main reactors of the hives. The geothermal plasma units deep within the planet's core were set to detonate one after another. This triggered a slow wave of relentless devastation across all of Badab Prime and led to tectonic shifts. The palace collapsed, but in the chaos of the hasty retreat from the surface of the dying world, the Loyalists suffered new losses, for which the Star Phantoms still harbour a considerable hatred towards the destroyers of Badab. Departing from the Maelstrom Zone, the Carcharodons had to play the final act of their performance, confirming their dark legend, what became known as the Sorrow of Tranquility. The Carcharodon fleet returned to the Endymion cluster and focused particularly on the Tranquility system, whose worlds had previously been recruitment and training grounds for the Mantis warriors. They plundered them and took youths from Solitude to replenish their losses, forcing them to fight each other to the death to prove their worthiness. The Firehawks hardly expected the Carcharodons to go so far. Having taken the Red Tithes, the Carcharodon ships left the cluster, the last time they were observed by the auger beacon of the explorators, which noted that they navigated through the warp, rising above the galactic plane and again moving away into the outer darkness. After the end of the Badab War, trials of the Separatists followed, during which unknown pages of history from that time were revealed. One such is considered the Corcyran massacre. Among the ruins of the old smuggling base in the dusty wastelands of Corcyra II, a Loyalist patrol found traces of a brutal battle between the companies of the Executioners and the Carcharodons. These two chapters fought each other to mutual extermination, destroying the base itself and turning its former inhabitants to dust. On the bodies of many warriors from both sides were signs that they continued to fight regardless of horrific wounds, severed limbs, and extensive injuries. Some were found clasped in deathly embraces, as if they continued to struggle before their demise. Whom the last breath expired warrior and executioner or a Carcharodon will remain under a veil of darkness, for both sides are sure that no one from there emerged alive. During the Indomitus Crusade, the world of Budor V was attacked by word-bearers. The heretics managed to establish a stronghold there and repel the attacks of the Fleet Secundus, the battle group Bataris. Soon, the sorcerers began a ritual to summon demons, which was interrupted by a sudden strike from the Carcharodon Astra, whose battle cruiser appeared in the void as part of the Fleet Secundus. All word-bearers were eventually killed. Adramalik recoiled, sensing a hint of holy power emanating from the pages. His fingers numbed, he dropped the pen and immediately stooped to pick it up. The task was unfinished. He had yet to inscribe the heroes of the chapter. At that moment, Arvak saw the approaching fleet and hastily issued commands to his subordinates, but knowing whom they were dealing with, he realized that the crucial moment had been lost. When he looked again into the void through the viewport of the captain's bridge, he saw a mass of torpedo volleys and the smoke trails of boarding capsules. In less than a minute, the captain's bridge was blown apart by an explosion. Predators from the outer darkness had come to the origins of the universe. Adramalik once again dipped his pen and with trembling fingers wrote the first name. The ink sparked with unnatural energy and dried instantly, sealing the smooth curves of the letters on the pristine page. Tiberos, better known by the nickname the Red Wake, you are a void-born and lord of the Carcharodon Astra, captain of the legendary battle barge Nikor. He is also the commander of the elite first company of the Carcharodons known as the Red Brethren. Those around him usually seem like dwarfs even when he sits. An absolutely immovable, colossal and silent judge, always delivering the final verdict. His Terminator armor is extensively modified to suit his physique. Dozens of brass rivets shine on the giant plates of grey ceramite, laid over plasteel blocks, which in turn are reinforced with adamantium rods. Hanging from the chain, whistling on the belt of the giant, dangles an ancient yellowing skull. Its eye sockets are as empty and lifeless as the black lenses on the helmet of the Red Wake, fashioned in the visage of a boar's snout. The pair of massive gloves he wears is even more terrifying, dubbed Tiberos. In the ancient fists bearing the names Hunger and Eradication, formidable power claws are combined with double-chain blades mounted below. Only by witnessing can one believe the carnage they can inflict. The ancient armor pulsates with monstrous power, necessary to sustain the thick bundles of the servo motor. Even in the air, the might of the apex predator can be felt. The origin of Tiberos's unique gloves is shrouded in mystery, and even the tech priests of Mars do not know the technology of their making. Rumors within the chapter say that during negotiations with the Ashen Claws, the Red Wake was provoked into a duel with Master Neakara Nev. Tiberos emerged victorious from this brutal encounter and demanded Hunger and Quencher as his reward. Ever since, the Master of the Ashen Claws has been seething with rage, provoking the Carcharodons whenever they come for negotiations. It is likely that Tiberos commanded the Carcharodons during the Badab War. His affiliation with this sinister and mysterious chapter was evident when he negotiated with other loyalist commanders with a barely audible whisper promising a swift, torturous death. When he first revealed his face, it was a nightmare-born skull, only half covered with white, corpse-like skin, a few muscles twisted into a bloodthirsty grimace, and his eyes were soulless and pitch-black. The few who have seen him in battle and managed to survive described him as a blood-soaked death machine, moving almost imperceptibly and leaving behind, after each strike, mutilated corpses, torn entrails, and bloody mire. He acts with astonishing precision, and each of his personal slaughters is the result of meticulous planning, not a burst of fury. Baal Shah. Rumors have it he is a native of the mining world of Zartak, and he used to be called Kadaric. Now he bears a different name and is the first Reaper and Master of the Third Company. He wears relic power armor, which he inherited from the previous master, on the chestplate of which is embossed the emblem of the unification wars of Old Earth, a skull and lightning bolts. The helm is crowned with an ominous ceramite crest. Painted along the stripe on his helmet visor is a white maw with sharp teeth, and above his left temple, the symbol of the Third Company, and shark and a scythe. The previous master of the company, Akia, perished somewhere in the early 800 years of the 41st millennium at the hands of the Tyranids. The Carcharodons returned to Zartak again when Shah had already been commanding his company, fighting the Night Lords, to later gather the Red Tithe, which was led by Baal Shah. While Adramalik was conducting the ritual, a captured Carcharodon took up position in the dark corridors. Within an hour, 3 of his brethren appeared in the reticle of his bolter. He placed his finger on the trigger and prepared to shoot. However, a whisper, soft as a feather, resounded in his head. "Have you resolved to kill your brothers?" "I have no choice. They will not take me back," the soldier mentally replied to the demon. "And do you wish to return to them?" Adramalik hesitated, his finger treacherously quivering on the trigger. "I must protect him. He has remade me." Again he sent the thought to the demon. "You still have a choice." Slowly and softly whispered the Unbound to him. The Carcharodon removed his finger from the trigger and laid down the bolter, then clutched his head. Terrible convulsions seized his body, blood flowing from his ears and eyes. Meanwhile, Adramalik continued. Teko Hurangi, better known as the Pale Nomad, is a powerful psyker, the chief librarian of the Carcharodons chapter, and one of the oldest living Adeptus Astartes. Despite his high title, he does not command other librarians but acts with the Third Company, which gathers the Red Tithe beyond combat operations. This is because the Carcharodons are outside the jurisdiction of the High Lords of Terror and act as a mobile, free to choose its targets and manner of action army. The dedication of Teko Hurangi to the cause of the Void Father is beyond question. Guided by secret knowledge, at the heart of which lies an ancient prophecy, Teko Hurangi instructs the Third Company in brief moments of rest and accompanies them on the battlefield. Teko Hurangi witnessed the rise of Baal Shah and was already considered very old. Despite the years lived, Hurangi is a formidable opponent in battle. both due to the physiology of an Astartes and by virtue of his psyker abilities. He was able to foresee the future, influence objects with the power of his mind, and also summon the destructive might of the warp upon his enemies. Suddenly, the acolytes surrounding Adramalik exploded into shreds under bolt of fire. Before he could turn his head to discern the enemy in the doorway, a second one had already approached him from behind. The claws of a power glove pierced his spine and emerged from his chest. A Carcharodon lifted the sorcerer's body into the air, then violently threw it aside. Bloody foam appeared on the lips of the word bearer. He struggled to say something but was unable to, then looked at the folio, which autonomously entered the final entry. Master of the squad, Manfor. It was he who commanded the strike cruiser Matahe when the Carcharodons attacked the word-bearers as part of the battle group Betaris of the fleet Secundus. However, not all heroes deserve the gratitude of worlds saved from the enemy, or the heartfelt spirit of camaraderie in combat zones. Allies remembered Manfor as a silent warrior covered in scars from whom emanated a predatory threat. His lethal fighters fought side by side with the Secundus flotilla at least twice, and witnesses to his brutality bestowed upon him many gloomy nicknames. For instance, the grim warriors of the Death Corps of Krieg remembered him as the Grey Ghost. Official records of his squad's battles in the Moran Belt are few, but Manfor's name became a call for terrible vengeance for many from the fleet Secundus. The word-bearers captured the Castellus Sanctic on Budor 5 and began the ritual to summon warp entities. Repelling one attack after another, they encircled their positions with ominous mists in which the unborn roamed. But this mist was also used to their advantage by the Carcharodons. Manfor began probing the enemy's defence, sending his fastest fighters to several points of Castellus's defences. They would appear, then retreat back into the mist. Eventually, the Carcharodons struck with increased force and doubled fury where the defence was weakest. Manfor's chainsword tore through the flesh of the unborn, clearing a path to his target. Within a few solar hours, the citadel was reduced to ruins. Vaulted arches were flooded with blood, and the squares were piled with mountains of bloodied corpses, grim monuments to imperial retribution. The folio snapped shut and burst into streams of immaterial energy, which immediately spread across the decks of the ship. 3 nearby Carcharodons were turned into stone statues. At the sight of the gravitational anomaly, which had become a trap for the origins of the universe, a warp rift opened, instantly sucking in all space debris and asteroids from the nearest belt. Then the portal snapped shut, leaving the oncoming Carcharodon astrofleet without its prize. It seemed the story of Adramalik had ended, but from the report of the Inquisitor assigned to the punitive fleet, the record was erased. Date unknown. Completing the report on the investigation of the newly discovered star system 51, 19 of the Segmentum Obscurus, I hereby report that no traces of Xenos, mutants or heretical cults have been detected. The 3 planets most suitable for habitation were subjected to terraforming and have been colonized. On the 8th day of staying with the fleet, I witnessed an anomaly never seen before. At the edge of the system, a colossal construction tumbled out of a warp rift, which I mistakenly classified as an Abyss-class battleship. However, after a purely visual inspection, I concluded that it was a space hulk, for it was made up of crumpled pieces of stone and metal mashed together like multicolored clay. The hull contained fragments of various spaceships. Wherever the hulk traveled, colonists went mad. Incidents of mass murder, looting and brigandage increased. Attempts to destroy this monster with the forces of planetary defense platforms and void weapons were unsuccessful because the projectiles only knocked out fine dust from its hull. The boarding teams sent there never returned. Having reached the opposite edge of System 51, 19, the space hulk disappeared as suddenly as it appeared. My attempts to match the uninvited guest with the file of known hulks were unsuccessful. However, the fleet's astropath helped in this matter, declaring that the ship was screaming its name into the warp, the origins of the world.